On the 1st of May 2026, the Daily Wire announced mass layoffs. The company that Ben Shapiro built into the largest conservative media operation in America, the thing that was supposed to be the right-wing answer to Hollywood and Netflix and the mainstream press, quietly cut a significant portion of its workforce from its Nashville offices. The same week, independent analytics confirmed that Shapiro's YouTube channel had lost somewhere between 70 and 85% of its peak viewership since late 2023. His estimated monthly YouTube income had roughly halved. His podcast had fallen off the top rankings on Spotify and Apple behind Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and Sean Ryan. His Facebook page was no longer among the 10 most engaged political accounts in the United States, despite Meta's algorithmic changes specifically designed to boost political content. The empire was not crumbling. It had already crumbled. May 1st was just when they finally admitted it publicly. This video is about how it happened, why it happened, what it means, and what replaced it. Because the collapse of conservative YouTube is not just a story about Ben Shapiro losing subscribers, it is a story about a generation that was sold a specific product, consumed it, grew out of it, and went looking for something real. And what they found when they went looking tells you more about where the culture is actually going than anything the collapsing empires of the old guard can tell you. Start with what these channels actually were. Because the reverence with which people discuss Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro and Charlie Kirk tends to obscure a fairly simple truth. These were not intellectuals, they were products, carefully designed, professionally produced, algorithmically optimized products that offered a specific experience to a specific audience at a specific moment in time. And like all products, they had a shelf life. Ben Shapiro built the Daily Wire on a formula so simple it is almost embarrassing in retrospect. Take a left-wing position, find the most ridiculous or extreme expression of it, dismantle it using basic logic and rhetorical speed, repeat. The tagline was, "Facts don't care about your feelings," and the product was the performance of intellectual superiority. Not genuine intellectual inquiry, the performance of it, the specific pleasure of watching someone be humiliated for holding a stupid opinion. That is what people were watching, that is what they were sharing, not because it was making them think more clearly about the world, because it felt good to see the team win. And, for a period, roughly 2015 to 2021, it worked extraordinarily well. The political left during that period was doing genuinely ridiculous things that were easy to mock. Safe spaces, trigger warnings, campus debates about whether words were violence. The specific brand of progressive excess that peaked around 2017 and 2018 produced a nearly unlimited supply of content for the debate bro format. Shapiro and Kirk and Crowder could film themselves walking onto campuses and within minutes find students saying things that the conservative audience found both offensive and laughable. The content wrote itself. The views came automatically, the donations followed. The empire expanded. Then, the moment passed. Not because the left became less ridiculous, because the audience grew up. The specific demographic that built these channels was young men. Predominantly, young men who were politically aware, who felt the culture was hostile to them, who wanted a framework for understanding what was happening and a community of people who shared their frustration. Shapiro and Peterson gave them that. The framework was simple. The left is wrong, here is why, here are the facts that prove it. The community was enormous and vocal and for a period genuinely exciting to be part of. But simple frameworks have a problem. They stop working when the questions get harder. The question that broke conservative YouTube was Israel, specifically what happened after October 7th, 2023, and the Israeli military campaign in Gaza that followed. The images that circulated, the casualty figures, the specific nature of what was happening in a densely populated civilian area, the growing evidence that unconditional American political and financial support for a specific military operation was being maintained not because it reflected American national interest or American public opinion, but because of the specific financial architecture of AIPAC and the donor networks around it. For most of the conservative commentator class, this question had one answer, and only one answer, and the answer was not open to revision regardless of what the evidence showed. Shapiro, who is Orthodox Jewish, treated any criticism of Israeli policy as anti-Semitism, and any departure from unconditional support as a moral failure. Kirk, before his death, had the same position. Peterson, increasingly theological and increasingly emotional, framed the conflict in terms of biblical prophecy that his audience found either incomprehensible or embarrassing. And the audience, The young men, who had come for honest analysis of what was actually happening in the world, looked at this and saw something they recognized. They saw a line that could not be crossed, a question that could not be asked, a donor that could not be offended. They had been told these people were fighting the establishment. They watched them protect the most specific and documented example of establishment purchase of American political life. And they started leaving. The Tucker Carlson war captures this precisely. In late 2025, Shapiro publicly called Carlson an intellectual coward and moral imbecile for interviewing people skeptical of Israel and echoing what Shapiro called anti-Semitic tropes. Carlson retaliated by slamming Shapiro's unconditional pro-Israel stance as bigotry and cruelty, particularly around Iran policy. Two of the most prominent faces of conservative media spent months publicly destroying each other on the specific question of whether American foreign policy should be allowed to be examined honestly. Carlson grew, Shapiro collapsed. The audience had already decided what it thought about that question. The Candace Owens story is the same story from a different angle. Owens had been one of the Daily Wire's biggest draws, a black conservative woman willing to say things that the rest of the conservative media class either would not say or said less forcefully. She was fired in 2024, with the stated reason being that her commentary on Israel had crossed a line. She launched her own channel, built it independently, and by mid-2025 was outperforming Shapiro on every platform metric. The audience followed her rather than the institution that fired her, because she was asking the questions the institution could not afford to ask. That pattern, the institution protecting a position it cannot honestly defend, while independent voices ask the actual questions, is the central story of the collapse of conservative YouTube. Now Jordan Peterson, because Peterson's story is different from Shapiro's and in some ways more interesting and in some ways more sad, Peterson arrived in 2016 as something genuinely unusual, a clinical psychologist at the University of Toronto who refused to comply with Canadian legislation requiring the use of preferred pronouns and who took the controversy that followed and turned it into a platform for ideas that were genuinely substantive. His lectures on psychology, mythology, and the relationship between individual responsibility and meaning, available for free on YouTube for years before he became famous, were serious. They were long, they required effort to follow, and they attracted millions of young men who were looking for something with genuine intellectual weight, something that treated them as adults capable of handling complexity. 12 Rules for Life, published in 2018, sold over 5 million copies. Clean your room, tell the truth, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not who someone else is today. Stand up straight, with your shoulders back. These were not profound philosophical discoveries, but they were delivered with enough psychological seriousness, enough reference to Jungian archetypes and Dostoevsky and the Bible, that they felt like they were pointing towards something real. The young men who read the book were not wrong to find it useful. The self-help content was grounded in genuine psychological research and genuine intellectual tradition. Peterson was not a fraud in the way that course sellers and manosphere grifters are frauds. He was offering something real. And then something happened. The benzodiazepine dependency crisis, the coma, the recovery in Russia. When Peterson emerged from that experience, he was different, more religious, more emotional, more prone to tears. The man who had built his reputation on the cool application of psychology to cultural questions became a man who wept frequently in public, who increasingly framed everything in explicitly Christian terms that alienated the large portion of his audience who had come for the psychology and the mythology rather than the theology, and who seemed to be increasingly operating as a vehicle for his own emotional processing rather than as a guide to anyone else's. The crying became the story. He cried on Piers Morgan after Morgan described him as a surrogate dad to millions. He had cried on Piers Morgan before that over Olivia Wilde calling him a hero to the incel community. He cried about Antifa, he cried about individualism. His daughter Michaela, who had herself built a significant online presence as a health influencer promoting the carnivore diet and various supplements, began explaining her father's public emotional instability as a symptom of mold exposure. He had CIRS, she said, chronic inflammatory response syndrome from a particularly moldy environment. The crying was the mold. Whether or not the medical explanation is accurate is beside the point. The point is that the man who had told millions of young men to take responsibility for themselves, to stop blaming the world for their problems, to stand up straight and face the difficulty of existence with dignity, That man was weeping on television about being called names by an actress and attributing his emotional instability to damp walls. The gap between the message and the messenger had become visible, and the audience that had come because they respected the intellectual seriousness found it increasingly difficult to maintain that respect. The social media coaching order made it worse. Canada's Supreme Court refused to hear his appeal against his professional regulatory body's order that he undergo coaching or risk losing his psychology license. The man who had positioned himself as a free speech martyr was being told by his own professional body to learn how to use social media responsibly, and the country's highest court had declined to intervene. The image of Peterson as a fearless truth-teller operating outside the institutional constraints that silenced everyone else became harder to sustain. His audience did not disappear overnight. He still has millions of subscribers, but the specific quality of reverence that had surrounded him, the sense that he was offering something essential that could not be found elsewhere, faded. The young men who had found genuine value in the early lectures started noticing that the newer content was repeating itself, that the biblical series, however impressive in ambition, was drifting further from the psychological foundations that had made the earlier work useful, that the man was increasingly performing Jordan Peterson rather than being him. Charlie Kirk was a different case entirely. Kirk did not pretend to be an intellectual, he was an organizer, a mobilizer. The founder of Turning Point USA understood that the youth conservative movement did not need a philosopher. It needed someone who could show up on campuses with a microphone and make conservatism feel exciting and tribal and fun for young people who had been told their entire lives by their universities that their values were wrong. He was extraordinarily good at this. The campus confrontation videos, the infrastructure of Turning Point chapters across thousands of American universities, the specific energy of a 22-year-old kid at a folding table with a sign that said there are only two genders asking students to engage with him. It was a spectacle rather than an argument. It generated enormous engagement precisely because it was designed to generate engagement rather than to persuade anyone of anything. But it worked on its own terms. Kirk was probably more responsible than any other single individual for the shift in young male voting toward Trump in 2024. He was shot and killed at Utah Valley University on the 11th of September 2025. He was 31 years old. The conservative movement's reaction was raw and genuine. Fox News anchors choked up on air. Trump called him the most legendary friend of America's youth. The grief was real because for many people Kirk had represented something real. Energy, commitment, the willingness to show up and make the fight. But what his death revealed, in the weeks and months that followed, was how much of what he had built depended on him personally. Not on an ideology or a movement that could survive his absence, on the specific energy of Kirk himself. Shapiro's channel saw a brief bump in views after the assassination, and then fell off a cliff at the end of October 2025 as the reality settled in. The youth conservative movement Kirk had built did not have an obvious successor. The campus operations continued, but the heart of them, the showmanship, the confrontational charisma, was gone. And the young people who had been in that orbit started asking a question they perhaps had not asked loudly enough while Kirk was alive. What had Turning Point USA actually produced? What had the campus debate victories actually changed? The housing was still unaffordable. The job market was still broken for young people. The Epstein files were still redacted. AIPAC had still spent $127 million on the 2024 elections. The specific institutional failures that were making young people's lives materially harder had not been meaningfully addressed by any of the debate victories or the campus events or the political mobilization. The spectacle had been enormous. The results were not. Steven Crowder is a footnote in this story, but a telling one. He built a genuinely large audience on YouTube doing a similar format to Shapiro, the liberal takedown, the debate ambush, the performative intellectual combat, and was demonetized by YouTube for comments about a gay journalist at Vox. He made his demonetization into a cause, moved to Rumble, built a paid subscriber base, and then had a very public falling out with the Daily Wire before he had even formally joined them, leaking the contract he described as slavery and publicly humiliating the people who had been negotiating with him. He demonstrated in the process that the conservative media class he was part of was primarily a business, competing for the same audience dollars, and that the ideological solidarity was a product like everything else. His audience followed him to Rumble, where they are now largely invisible to the broader conversation because Rumble has a fraction of YouTube's reach, and the algorithm does not surface his content to new audiences. He won the battle against YouTube and lost the war by seeding the platform where discovery actually happens. Tucker Carlson is the counterintuitive data point in all of this, and he deserves his own examination because his trajectory runs in exactly the opposite direction from the rest of the conservative media class, and the reason why is the answer to the central question of this whole story. Carlson left Fox News in April 2023 in circumstances that remain disputed. Fox paid out the remainder of his contract, reported to be approximately $20 million, to make him go away. He launched on X, where his interview with Vladimir Putin generated over 200 million views. He interviewed people that no one else in the mainstream conservative media would touch. He went to Tucker Carlson Network and built a direct subscriber relationship with his audience without an advertiser or a corporate structure or an institutional position telling him what was off limits. And he grew. While everything around him shrank, he grew. While Shapiro was losing subscribers in 15 of 16 consecutive months, Carlson was adding 1.2 million followers across platforms in a single quarter. While the Daily Wire was laying off staff, Carlson's operation was expanding. The reason is specific. Carlson was willing to ask the questions the institutional conservative media had decided were off limits. The Israel question, the Ukraine question, the specific donors and interests that had purchased American foreign policy, the deep state criticism that went further than the performative anti-establishment posturing of the Shapiro generation, that actually named names and followed the money and refused to stop at the line where the money ran out. His interview with Nick Fuentes generated enormous controversy. His criticism of American foreign policy aligned him with people his former colleagues found unacceptable, and his audience did not care, because his audience had not come for the respectability, they had come for the questions. This is the specific thing that conservative YouTube at its peak had not understood about its own audience. The audience that built those channels was not a conservative audience in the traditional sense. It was a skeptical audience, a distrustful audience, an audience that had concluded that the mainstream was lying about important things and was looking for people who would say so honestly. That audience did not care about party affiliation or ideological respectability. It cared about whether you were willing to follow the argument wherever it actually led. Shapiro had positioned himself as the brave truth-teller, willing to say what the mainstream would not say, but there was a whole category of truth-telling he was structurally unable to do. Tucker Carlson stepped into that space, and the audience that had built Shapiro's empire moved with him. The specific irony of Shapiro calling Carlson an intellectual coward is extraordinary when you think about it carefully. Shapiro, the man who built a media empire on the claim that he was willing to say the hard things, publicly attacking the one person in conservative media who was still growing precisely because he was willing to say harder things than Shapiro. The intellectual cowardice accusation bounced off Carlson and landed somewhere else entirely, because they did not go to CNN, they did not go back to the BBC, they did not start watching Fox News or reading the New York Times. The institutional media that the conservative YouTube class had spent years attacking as corrupt and dishonest did not recover its audience when conservative YouTube started collapsing, the thing they had wanted from Shapiro and Peterson in the first place, which was genuine intellectual engagement with the actual questions. Not the performance of it, not the product version of it that had been designed and packaged and optimized for engagement metrics, the actual thing. And what they found was a generation of independent creators doing something completely different from what the old guard had been doing. Not debate bro content, not culture war reaction videos, long form content, deep dives into history, serious philosophical analysis, the kind of content that requires sustained attention and rewards it, that after an hour of watching you feel like you understand something you did not understand before. Google's own research shows that over the last 3 years, searches for video essays on YouTube have been rising consistently. The format, typically 25 minutes to an hour of one person going deep on a topic, is growing faster than almost any other content category on the platform. Not because of any particular algorithm push, because the audience that had been consuming shallow political content started getting bored of it and started looking for something with more substance. Among adults under 30, trust in social platforms as a news source now nearly matches trust in national news outlets. More than half of Americans who get news from independent creators believe those creators are not connected to media companies or institutional interests. The independence is the point. The audience knows, at some level, that the Shapiros and the Kirks were products backed by institutional money and institutional interests. that shaped what they could and could not say. The independent creator who has no donor class to protect and no institutional position to maintain can say what they actually see. That quality, the sense that someone is speaking without a ceiling over their head, is what the audience is increasingly searching for. Here is what the new generation of serious YouTube is actually doing, and why it is working in a way that conservative YouTube in its prime never quite managed. The conservative YouTube model was fundamentally reactive. It needed the left to do something ridiculous, and then it reacted to that ridiculous thing. It was entirely dependent on the culture war for its content. When the specific flavour of progressive excess that had sustained the debate bro format peaked and started declining, the content became repetitive. There are only so many ways to explain that biological sex is real. There are only so many campus debate victories you can film. The format had a built-in ceiling because it could not generate content on its own. It could only react. The new generation of independent long-form content is not reactive. It is generative. It goes into history and finds the stories that illuminate the present in ways that no amount of contemporary political commentary can. It engages with philosophy not to cite Nietzsche in a debate about whether to use preferred pronouns, but to actually work through what figures like Nietzsche and Tocqueville and Gibbon can tell us about the specific civilizational moment we are living in. It does not need the culture war to generate content because it has several thousand years of human experience to draw from. It was going to be interesting regardless of what was trending on Twitter that week. The young men who found their way to this kind of content described the experience in terms that sound almost religious. The sense that something had been unlocked, that they were finally receiving the education they had been promised by institutions that had delivered something considerably less, that the history they had been taught in school, dry, thin, ideologically managed, stripped of the actual drama and the actual decisions and the actual consequences, was not the history that existed, that the real history was extraordinary, that the great human questions about power and decline, about what civilizations are made of and what destroys them, about the specific kinds of people who build things and the specific kinds of people who destroy them, had been worked through by serious thinkers for thousands of years and were available to anyone willing to spend the time on them. This is what the grifters never understood. Peterson came close to it. His early lectures on the psychological significance of ancient myths, his readings of Dostoevsky, his engagement with Jung, that material was pointing toward the library of genuine human wisdom that exists outside and beyond any contemporary political controversy, but he kept being pulled back into the culture war, the pronoun controversy, the debates, the Fox News appearances, the content that generated the most immediate engagement always trumped the content that would have produced the most lasting value. The generation that is building its understanding of the world from genuine history and genuine philosophy, rather than from culture war reaction content, is developing something that the debate bro audience never fully developed. A framework that does not depend on the left doing something ridiculous to sustain it. An understanding of civilizational patterns that does not require a political villain to remain coherent. The ability to look at what is happening in the world right now and place it in the context of what has happened before, not as a rhetorical move, but as a genuine analytical tool. The Roman Empire did not fall because of a debate that someone lost on campus. It fell because of the specific internal dynamics that Edward Gibbon spent 6 volumes describing. The British Empire did not collapse because the BBC said the wrong thing in 1950. It collapsed because of specific structural exhaustions that the Germans had identified by 1939. The Weimar Republic did not fail because Jordan Peterson was not available to clean it up. It failed because of specific economic and institutional conditions that had specific historical antecedents. Understanding any of this, actually understanding it, not just knowing that someone said it, is a different kind of knowledge from knowing that Ben Shapiro won an argument with a sophomore on a Tuesday afternoon in 2019. And the specific audience that is developing this kind of understanding, young men who have found their way to serious history and serious philosophy through independent YouTube channels and long-form podcasts and reading that they are doing because they want to, rather than because they are required to, are not going to be captured by the next version of conservative YouTube when it is rebuilt, because they have tasted something better. And you cannot go back to the performance of intellectual engagement after you have experienced the real thing. The grifters and the frauds, and that word is accurate for a significant portion of what was built under the banner of conservative commentary, operated on the assumption that the audience did not really want the serious version, that they wanted the entertaining version, That long, difficult, genuinely demanding content would not get the views that the quick takedown videos and the campus confrontation clips got, and for a period they were right. The quick content did better than the slow content. The reaction video got more views than the deep historical analysis. But the audience that built conservatism's YouTube dominance was young, and young people grow up, and the specific intellectual restlessness that brought them to those channels in the first place, the sense that the mainstream was hiding things, that the official narrative was incomplete, that the questions being asked in mainstream culture were too shallow and too managed. That restlessness did not go away when they got bored of Shapiro. It went looking for something that would actually satisfy it. The generation that came after Peterson and Shapiro and Kirk will not be built around a political identity or a culture war or a debate format. It will be built around genuine curiosity, around the specific pleasure of understanding things properly, of not just knowing that Rome fell, but of knowing how and why and what the people living through it thought was happening and how wrong most of them were, around the philosophical tradition that Western civilization produced and that its universities have largely stopped teaching seriously, around the uncomfortable, honest analysis of what is actually happening in the world without the ceiling of an undisclosed donor relationship determining what questions can and cannot be asked. The audience is there. It has always been there. It was consuming the product version of what it wanted because the real version was not available yet at scale. The real version is becoming available, and the product version is losing 85% of its viewership and laying off half its staff. Ben Shapiro built a media empire on facts don't care about your feelings. The fact that his empire is collapsing does not care about his feelings either. The generation that is done with the grifters is the same generation that can name the Gracchi brothers and explain why their deaths matter. That has read Orwell not because a YouTube video told them he was important, but because they picked up the book and found out for themselves. That can look at the specific patterns of civilizational decline and place the current moment inside them without needing a political villain to make the story work. That generation is not waiting for the next Shapiro. It is not looking for the next Peterson. It has already moved somewhere the old guard cannot follow, not because the old guard lacks the intelligence to get there, but because getting there requires giving up the thing that made them rich. The donor relationships, the political alignments, the questions that cannot be asked because the people funding the operation have decided they cannot be asked. The new generation of serious independent commentary does not have those constraints. It has something more valuable, the trust of an audience that has already been burned once and is not going to be burned the same way twice. An audience that has already seen what a product looks like and knows the difference between a product and the real thing. The old guard is gone or going. What replaces it will be built on something they could not offer: the truth, without a ceiling. And here is the specific thing that nobody in the mainstream conversation about this transition is willing to say directly. The collapse of conservative YouTube is not a victory for the left. The audience did not go left. The audience went deeper. It went into territory that the left-right framework cannot contain and cannot describe and cannot capture. It went into the genuine history of civilizations and the genuine philosophy of the Western tradition and the genuine analysis of power and how it operates and what it has always done and what it is doing now. That analysis does not produce comfortable conclusions for either side. It does not validate the progressive narrative about the direction of history any more than it validates the conservative one. It produces something more uncomfortable and more useful, an accurate picture of where we are and how we got here. The young man who has read Gibbon on the decline of Rome is not going to be recruited into the next version of the Shapiro operation when someone builds it, because he knows now that the specific pattern he is watching in American institutions, the concentration of power, the capture of the political class by money, the bread and circuses, the hollowing of the forms of democracy while the substance drains away, is not a left-right story. It is a civilizational story, one that has played out before, one that has specific stages and specific dynamics and specific moments where the direction can be changed and specific moments where it cannot. The young man who has engaged seriously with Tocqueville understands the soft despotism argument and can apply it to what he is watching on his phone in a way that no amount of Shapiro content ever produced. The young man who has read seriously about the Weimar Republic understands economic precarity and institutional failure and the specific conditions that produce political extremism in ways that Kirk's campus confrontations never got close to. The young man who has engaged with the full sweep of British imperial history understands the specific trajectory of great powers in decline in a way that no culture war reaction video was ever going to provide. This is the audience that has formed on the other side of the conservative YouTube collapse, not radicalized. Not radicalizable in the ways the old model understood radicalization, too educated in the genuine historical record to be captured by simplistic narratives, too aware of how propaganda works, having watched Operation Mockingbird confirmed, having watched the CIA's pre-publication review of former officers' public statements, having watched the specific mechanisms of institutional capture operate in real time, to be easily managed by the next iteration of the product. They are skeptical of everything, including the channels they watch, including this one. And that skepticism, if it is honest skepticism grounded in genuine engagement with evidence rather than reflexive contrarianism, is exactly what a serious democracy requires from its citizens. It is what the founding generation of Americans thought they were building the conditions for. It is what the conservative YouTube empire, for all its anti-establishment posturing, was not building because it could not afford to. The grifters built audiences, the frauds built revenue, the serious people who come after them will build something that matters more than either. Understanding. Not the performance of it, the thing itself. Ben Shapiro built a media empire on facts, don't care about your feelings. The fact that his empire is collapsing does not care about his feelings either. The generation that is done with the grifters is the same generation that can name the Gracchi brothers and explain why their deaths matter. That has read Orwell not because a YouTube video told them he was important, but because they picked up the book and found out for themselves. That can look at the specific patterns of civilizational decline and place the current moment inside them without needing a political villain to make the story work. That generation is not waiting for the next Shapiro. It is not looking for the next Peterson. It has already moved somewhere the old guard cannot follow. Not because the old guard lacks the intelligence to get there, but because getting there requires giving up the thing that made them rich, the donor relationships, the political alignments, the questions that cannot be asked because the people funding the operation have decided they cannot be asked. The new generation of serious independent commentary does not have those constraints. It has something more valuable. The trust of an audience that has already been burned once and is not going to be burned the same way twice. An audience that has already seen what a product looks like and knows the difference between a product and the real thing. What comes next is not conservative, it is not liberal, it is serious. And serious is the one thing the collapsing empires of the old guard were never quite able to be.